Picture this. It's 1954, and the world's most powerful government is about to overthrow another country's democracy. But here's the twist. They're doing it partly to protect a fruit company. This sounds like fiction, but it's one of the most documented conspiracies in modern history. Welcome to the story of how United Fruit Company helped orchestrate the overthrow of Guatemala's government. To understand this incredible tale, we need to go back to the early 1900s. United Fruit Company, founded in 1899, had become the undisputed king of Central American bananas. But they weren't just selling fruit, they were building an empire. The company owned over 550,000 acres in Guatemala alone. They controlled the country's only Atlantic port, most of its railroad network, and the telegraph system. United Fruit had essentially created a state within a state. Guatemalans had a nickname for their own country, the United Fruit Company Republic. For decades, this arrangement worked perfectly for the company and Guatemala's dictators. But in 1944, everything changed. A democratic revolution swept Guatemala, ending years of brutal military rule. Juan José Arevalo became president, promising education, workers' rights, and social reform. United Fruit was nervous, but they could live with Arevalo. Then came 1951, and the election of Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was different. He was serious about land reform. In Guatemala, just 2% of the population owned 70% of the land. Most of it sat unused while Guatemalan peasants starved. Arbenz's solution was Decree 900, a comprehensive land redistribution program. The government would buy unused land at tax-assessed value and give it to landless farmers. It was actually quite moderate. They'd compensate landowners fairly. But here's where United Fruit had a problem. They had been massively underreporting their land values to avoid taxes. Now the government was offering to pay them exactly what they claimed the land was worth. United Fruit would lose 85% of their Guatemalan holdings for a fraction of their real value. The company immediately launched a campaign to destroy Arbenz. They had serious connections in Washington. Both Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Alan Dulles had worked for United Fruit's law firm. The company's PR firm began spreading the message: Arbenz was a communist. This was 1952, the height of American Cold War paranoia. The mere suggestion of communism in the Western Hemisphere was enough to terrify Washington. Never mind that Arbenz was a democratically elected moderate reformer. Never mind that his policies were inspired by Roosevelt's New Deal, not Marx. United Fruit's propaganda machine was incredibly sophisticated. They hired the same firm that created the Lucky Strike means fine tobacco campaign. American newspapers began running stories about the communist threat in Guatemala. Time magazine featured Arbenz on the cover with the headline read Jacobo. The campaign worked perfectly. American public opinion turned against Guatemala. President Eisenhower, convinced of the communist threat, authorized Operation PB Success. This would be the CIA's first major covert operation to overthrow a government. The plan was elaborate. They would fund and arm Guatemalan exiles while running a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign. The CIA created a fake radio station called Voice of Liberation. It broadcast from neighboring Honduras, claiming to be the voice of Guatemalan resistance. The station spread disinformation about massive rebel armies advancing on the capital. Meanwhile, CIA planes dropped leaflets and staged fake air raids. The psychological pressure was immense. Guatemala City was gripped by panic, but the actual rebel force was pathetically small, maybe 150 men total. Led by Carlos Castillo Armas, they were poorly equipped and completely outmatched. The Guatemalan army could have crushed them easily. But here's where the psychological warfare paid off. Arbenz's own military began to turn against him. They believed the CIA's lies about massive rebel forces and Soviet support. When Arbenz ordered his military to fight, his commanders refused. Faced with a complete collapse of support, Arbenz had no choice. On June 27, 1954, he resigned in a radio address to the nation. "A cruel and terrible campaign of libel has been unleashed against my government," he said. The CIA had succeeded. A democratically elected government had fallen without a real battle. Castillo Armas marched into Guatemala City as the new president. One of his first acts was to return United Fruit's land. The moderate land reform that could have helped millions was completely reversed. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Castillo Armas launched a brutal crackdown on anyone suspected of leftist sympathies. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Labor unions were banned, voting rights were restricted, and press freedom disappeared. Guatemala descended into decades of military dictatorship and civil war. Over the next 36 years, an estimated 200,000 Guatemalans would die in political violence. Most were indigenous Mayans who had supported land reform. Meanwhile, United Fruit got everything it wanted. The company's stock price soared after the coup. American shareholders celebrated while Guatemalans suffered. The operation became the CIA's template for future covert interventions. They would try similar tactics in Cuba, Chile, Nicaragua, and beyond. The Guatemala coup proved that propaganda could be more powerful than armies. It showed how corporate interests and government policy could merge seamlessly. But perhaps most importantly, it revealed the true cost of putting profits before people. Years later, declassified documents would confirm what many suspected. Arbenz had never been a communist. He was exactly what he claimed to be: a democratically elected leader trying to help his people. The entire communist threat had been manufactured by United Fruit's PR machine. Even President Eisenhower later admitted he had doubts about the operation. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The 1954 Guatemalan coup stands as one of history's most successful corporate conspiracies. It's a story that reveals the hidden connections between American business and foreign policy. And it shows how easily democracy can be destroyed when powerful interests align. Today, United Fruit Company no longer exists. It became Chiquita Brands in the 1970s. But the lessons of Guatemala remain as relevant as ever. Because this story isn't really about bananas, it's about power. And power, once unleashed, rarely stays contained to a single country or a single decade.